This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I am here today with Conn Carroll. I do want to say it's a little weird because I remember I was watching Blogging Heads when you were the weekly person, and you would have it was like the weekend blog. You were at a hotline. I was a lot younger then.
Chuck Todd was a lot younger then.
Yeah. The funniest one I do have to say is the one that where you had Matt Stoller on, and he was a real dick, and you were just trying to not to you, but to Tim Russert, and I just remember you were just like, okay, I'm not going to agree with you that Tim Russert is a piece of shit or whatever he was. Right. And you're just like, I was like, really, because you were just like, okay. Like Stoller's like, what do you like about Russert? I don't know. It was just really weird because I don't know. I think it's prefigured a little bit of Stoller's personality in the present.
No, Stoller's a strident guy. I think that's always been his kind of MO, and I think it works to him for a certain degree. And I think he has cooled down a bit, but I'm sure at the time he was blaming Russert for the Iraq War and thousands and millions of deaths, and so it was I wasn't surprised. I mean, I had him on because he was a popular strident guy on the left and an interesting voice, and he still is today.
Yeah, and so you've done a variety of things. Obviously, I think you worked at Heritage. I have to say when you were working at the Hotline and you were hosting blogging heads, I didn't know your politics. You kind of, you were asked directly, I think, a couple of times, and you admitted it, but. You kind of played it straight ahead.
Yeah, this was years ago. If you want to go back that far, right? So this is 2006, 2007. So I'm covering the online left, Daily Kos at its infancy, and I was hired as a straight reporter by Chuck. Chuck knew I was a conservative, but that whole Hotline staff, he tried to keep ideologically mixed. So we always admitted where we were when people asked us, but my job was to play it down the line. And I actually developed a lot of friendships with people on the left, Jane Hampshire, Chris Bowers, people who didn't really kind of know my politics, but felt that I covered them fairly. So. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a different way than the moral clarity that we had in the teens. So the young ones are like, okay, what is he talking about? But we're not here to talk about politics directly initially. So, I just want to mention, you're an editor at DC Examiner now. You worked with Mike Lee on his staff, senator from Utah. He's a constitutional lawyer by training, senator by vocation now. And so, I saw you on Bob Wright's show. And you have a new book on monogamy. It's called Sex and the Citizen: How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. I did read it, unlike Bob. It was a quick read.
Thank you.
There was a whole thing about how he didn't read it. Okay, so I did want to say I did read it. And it was a quick read. It was a quick read for me. I do have to say, this is gonna sound weird, but the evolution and the history parts I could have written in terms of
I think that's a compliment. I think that's a compliment.
Yeah, it was okay, so it was quick for me because I'm this is what I know the citations and everything like that, and so I think so it's called Sex and the Citizen: How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. I want to make it clear to the listener that actually at least half of the book is not directly policy. It's actually evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology. There's references a lot to Joe Henrich and the Weirdest People in the World type work. It's a lot of history with the Western Marriage Family Program. If you read Adam Bellows nepotism from the early 2000s. There's some similar stuff, and then of course you are a political guy in terms of like as your vocation, you have been, and so you talk about policy issues, but it's not the policy part is not super strident, to be honest. I would say like I've read some of that stuff, like for example about the National Welfare Rights Organization and all the welfare stuff. You can read that in John McWhorter, who is centrist okay. I mean, you're not like a hardcore, like look, it's not like, it doesn't feel liberal by the end of the book, but it's not actually, in my opinion, not super political. So I really want to make that clear to people, because the subtitle makes it seem a little bit, I think, a little sound more political than it is. Not my opinion.
Oh no, and that's by choice. You're trying to market a book and you want to throw a fastball, and so it's definitely a book that is going to policy wise, as you say, kind of more appeal to the right. When you look at the polling, just in general, people on the left are less enthusiastic about marriage. You could make an argument. I could have gone, straight to them and say, "Hey, this is the history of marriage. This is why you should do it." But it is, while that is a big part of the book, I think honestly, at the end of the day, most of the policy prescriptions are kind of center right, and that's the audience for the book.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I actually I was on a flight yesterday, so I read it during the flight. So it was just read it in one sitting. It was pretty good. So some of the stuff, like, and I want to go like like let's start with kind of go vaguely by chapters. I think one question that I want to ask is, because like I tried to read Sex at Dawn,
Christopher Ryan
before. Yeah, and like I think there was a book, Sex at Dusk. I actually bought that book too,
which directly refutes his book. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask a question. It's like, what the hell is Ryan thinking? I mean, I don't know how to like say it, because it's like the reason I can't finish it. I'm like, what the hell is he thinking? Like, this is just BS, kind of like. I'm just being like,
yeah. Well, look, I mean, just look at the fact that the New York Times every month, at least every other week, has some story on polyamory, some story on marriage not being worth it, and there's a market there. And I think Christopher Ryan, clearly met it, and he dressed it up in some type of cherry picked science. And I mean, just don't Google it, but go on YouTube and search his name, and you'll see all kinds of different kind of center left let's explore sexuality type podcasts that had him on, and I think it was a New York Times bestseller. So, I mean, I think he wanted to sell books, and he did. So congrats. I mean, as far as the truth value of the book, I, of course, think he's full of it. But, it was a commercial success. So good for him.
Yeah. And like, so talk about what the thesis of what Sex at Dawn is, and why it's wrong.
Oh, okay. Well, kind of the thesis of Sex at Dawn is that we're not naturally monogamous, that we are, in fact, kind of more bent towards polyamory, towards living in kind of a not polygamous horde, but more of a
it's like all on all is
right.
The way I would.
Right. Or what's the Marx Engels term? Just promiscuous horde. That's kind of more his vision of what humanity before civilization looked like. And he doesn't mention this, but it's actually shared by Marx and Engels, and is a big part of their Communist Manifesto. And so I do go into the book where Marx and Engels got their idea from, and it wasn't totally wrong. I mean, it was. It wasn't totally unbased. So basically, there was this guy named Henry Louis Morgan in upstate New York, who was one of the first anthropologists, and he befriended the Iroquois tribe up there by defending them in a lawsuit where some corporation was trying to steal their land. And so he really was kind of one of the first ones who got to learn the language, got to see their customs up close. And while the Iroquois themselves were monogamous, the way that they referred to some relations like aunt, uncle, didn't have those words. All those words kind of had the same root. They say people call them mother and father, where not that they're aunt or uncle. So then he thought that because of that language quirk, which then he found out existed in other Native American tribes and existed in places in Southeast Asia and Africa, Henry Louis Morgan then developed this theory that at some point humanity must have had been in this like promiscuous horde. So it was that early reporting on the Iroquois that Marx and Engels then based their idea of what human nature was. Since then, anthropology has gotten a little bit better. We've discovered that that's completely false. And as I know in the book, there's no hunter-gatherer non-sedentary tribe that's ever been encountered that has not been monogamous, that has not had marriage. There's no society anywhere where people are just promiscuously having sex with each other. Doesn't exist.
Yeah, all right, so I'm gonna say something kind of gross because it's evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology and sex, but so I'm a geneticist, so this is why I was like, okay, this is just obviously not right. When you have a promiscuous horde issue, the selection starts to happen in terms of the sperm, okay? The sperm and the semen. So common chimpanzees, they tend to have a gluing issue, okay? Because like they're promiscuous, and so they're competing with each other's sperm within the same female. And so that's how you know that it's a promiscuous horde. We don't have that. Humans do not have that. So this means that there is very little sperm competition, which means that men are not like a bunch of males are not having sex with the same female all the time, at least in the past, right? And so we can have all these sorts of debates about polyamory and all this stuff, but I think what you're presenting in the beginning of the book, where we as a social primate, went towards monogamy, you bring up the size difference. That's just like an obvious one. Like if we have a hyper polygamous population, we're like gorillas, right? Or even common chimpanzees. Even chimpanzees have like common chimpanzees have a big sex difference, right? Can you just like talk about like?
Well, yeah, I don't have the exact percentages in front of me. Yeah, but yeah, actually, in an earlier version of the book, one of my first drafts, I had a whole chapter on ape and monkey sexuality, which my editor decided most people weren't into. You might have been into it. I was into it. I wrote it. But long story short, the more promiscuous polygamous a species is, the larger the size differences between the males and females, and more importantly, the less care the males give. Okay. So when you look at chimpanzees, which do live in a promiscuous horde, you have a large size difference between males and females. But when you look at something like the gibbon, who is much more monogamous, not fully monogamous, they cheat around more than humans, but they form monogamous pairs for a long time. There is not much of a size difference. And male gibbons provide much more care to the young than chimpanzees do. And then when you get to tamarins, which are actually a monkey a little bit further from us, but still a primate, these are arguably more monogamous than us. They form lifelong pair bonds and they don't cheat. The males actually provide more care for infants than the females. So not only is there a relation between the size difference, is that the more monogamous they are, the more likely they are to be the same size, but the more care the male then gives to the offspring.
Yeah, and I do have to say, we'll move past animals in a bit, but one thing with mammals, unlike birds, so birds have eggs. They're not totally monogamous, but monogamish.
I mentioned that in the book.
Yeah, you do. You hit. It's a very, very broad book. You hit you cover a lot of bases that I'm pretty honestly, I was pretty impressed. Like people should.
Thank you.
You did a lot of reading in there, or you knew it all. I don't know, but it was like you went from like evolution to, I don't know, like some bill in Congress in like 1971. That's the range of the book. So mammals tend to be on the more polygynous side. One male, many females. Males compete. They have the big canines or whatever, or they compete indirectly. But one of the issues with mammals, as opposed to birds, is males do not provide that much care. Males are more like a male lion. Yeah, they might defend the pride or whatever. But like they're basically just like hanging around, peacocking, whatever. Human males, like gibbons, are different, right? It just seems we are different. You could say, like what Ryan or other people would say, like, oh, like this is like our culture. No, I mean like our size, the fact that we don't have canines, the fact that like our sperm is, it's gross to say, but it's watery. So it's just like we're not having like constant competitive sex offs or whatever you want to think, right? And so. This is how we are evolutionarily. We're relatively egalitarian, relatively monogamous. So that obviously doesn't mean strictly like always, but we're not like elephant seals. Like one male does not like breed with the whole, group of females in the horde. Hyperpolygyny is not a thing until it is. And so why don't you take it over at this point?
Well, if I could just take one step back, because, we talk about getting males involved and getting the fathers involved, and that's part of it. But marriage is so much more than that. It brings 3 generations into what I call a long-term project of cooperative care. So not only do you have dad helping out, but because the siblings can now see who dad is, right, and see that the relationship forming, they can now help mom out, and they can also, dad can now help them out in getting and acquiring the skills they need to succeed. And then also because most of our ancestors, chimpanzees, it is the females who relocate when they become sexually mature. Okay, what that means is that mom's mom is not around to help her when she has children. However, who is around is dad's mom. And the only way dad's mom is going to help out is if dad's mom knows which kids are her sons. And so it's only through monogamy that you have grandparents coming in. And of course, J.D. Vance got dinged for this. This is the grandmother hypothesis, because we're only one of the only species in the world that females have extended amounts of life after sexual maturity. You have females, great grandmothers coming in, helping out with care for the young. And then so now you have 3 generations all helping mom give her the help she needs to get calories and everything else to support her children. So it's not monogamy, and the advantages it gives humans are not just about dads helping out. Oh, that's a big part of it. But it's about binding that whole nuclear family together, cross-generation wise. And that what makes us so unique and so special. But then it all changed, as you said. And so there we come to agriculture and sedentary living. And so once you have a system where you have sedentary living, people have more property, acquiring more wealth, all of a sudden you have a class of people who are not just fighting every once in a while, they're fighting professionally, and those end up being, kind of more the higher power people. Those people end up dominating other people. And so throughout the world, another big point of the book is that, monogamy is not something weird that Mormons used to do and Muslims still do. It's something that everyone did everywhere for 10,000 years. Like sedentary life happens and then polygamy spreads. So the book kind of takes a world tour, from Mesopotamia, starting off with the Babylonians, India, China. Europe is not any different. We look at the Vikings. Of course, we look at Africa and the Mali Empire there, and then of course we look at the Aztecs in the Americas, and all this polygamy is everywhere. Slavery and polygamy are the human norm from the time of agriculture up until Christianity starts spreading.
Yeah. So this is when I said this could be written by me and whatever. It's like it draws on like a huge body of anthropology. I remember I very specifically in 2004 I wrote a post on my blog at the time where it seemed to me from reading the anthropology that some of these egalitarian hunter gatherers, their social relations, their family life, their marriages, was more like America, whereas a lot of these quote traditional societies, like the traditional Eurasian societies, right? Like the stuff that's you read in the Bible or you read in Homer or whatever, they were way different with the inequality, and all this stuff. And so I thought, in a way, my hypothesis was one of the geniuses of Western civilization, of America, but Western civilization more generally, is that it's actually more closely aligned with some of our evolved preferences and intuitions. So I'm going to give,
I think it's very counterintuitive for a lot of people, but that's the argument the book makes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so for example, like romantic love, like, people, you talk to like English literature, like, well, romantic love was invented by the troubadours and whatever, and I'm just like, I get what they're saying, but like, that's just like, everyone knows that's not true. Like, you don't turn like 12 or 13 and then all of a sudden the cultural indoctrination kicks in and
Yeah.
you start to fall in love with the opposite sex. Yeah.
That's why I love, and I will pick on the New York Times here, but you read all these New York Times articles shitting on monogamy, and they always make it seem like marriage didn't exist until Disney started creating cartoons in the 1960s, and that created like this cultural norm that has been tormenting us ever since. It's like, no, the Disney Corporation did not create monogamous marriage in 1950. That's not how any of this works.
Yeah. Well, I think you see the surface in some cultures periodically. So, one of the big things is like, if you guys, there's a famous like statue of a Etruscan couple. And art historians are always like, look at the way the couple are like interacting and engaging. It just feels very modern to us, and that's partly because the elite corporate marriage, like I'll just say corporate, like not in like a financial sense, but in terms of just like families and corporate identity, was not for marriage. It was not for love. It was not necessarily companionate. It was for like reproduction, production, and consolidation. But you see in like some of these paintings, in some of these depictions, you see things that are all that are very modern. And I don't think that it's because they're modern. I think it's because for whatever reason, they reflect in that culture and in that time something that we recognize. Also, like Akhenaten with Nefertiti is very similar, where it's like they seem like a loving couple. Was this because they were culturally indoctrinated into love? No, it's because, I mean, and even in like a lot of societies, like tragic love is a common like motif, because I mean, everyone knows you're not supposed to marry someone from this caste or this ethnic group or whatever, but that's because those are the rules. That's not how you really want to feel, right?
Yeah, no, I go into the, this is biochemistry of it, right? I mean, there are powerful chemicals reacting in your body during sex that make you bond with the other person, and it's not by accident. It's when we say evolution has design, it's by design that we are supposed that the act of sex emotionally binds us to our partners. So this whole idea you have later that separates sex from love, that's just not how we're meant to be. That's just not how we're created.
Yeah. No. I mean, that part of it, because this is jumping to Christianity. I want to go a little bit through the pre-Christian period, but some of the stuff you're describing, I'm just like, okay, but like, everything that they're describing here is probably just part of like just like a biologically prescribed package on how to bind a pair bond together. I mean, like, this could be written by Desmond Morris. Like basically St. Paul. I mean, okay, not quite Desmond Morris, but you know what I'm saying. It's just like, it's not like you're not indoctrinated into understanding what a couple is. A couple naturally emerges, but there are social forces in many societies that keep couples apart because it's not convenient for the broader group, right?
Well, not convenient for the broader group. Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, I think when you look at the power of polygamy and slavery, a lot of times what was keeping couples apart was the power of wealthy men to monopolize women. and that has been the story of humanity for much of recorded history. Yeah,
I don't want to get like a sideline, but some of the romances about King Arthur, that also like erupts, right, with Guinevere and Lancelot.
Oh, yeah. But, I mean, there's tons of great stories in literature around there. The first piece of literature we have in existence, I cover this in the book, the Epic of Gilgamesh, covers this topic, right? So Gilgamesh is this beautiful demigod who's ruling over a town, I forget, Urkut in Babylonia. And basically,
it's Uruk. It's Uruk. It's close. It's Uruk.
He's a powerful ruler, ruling over the city-state. But the problem is, he's basically having sex with whoever he wants, whenever he wants. And the people are crying out, and they pray to the god and say, "Deliver us from this tyrant." And so the gods send down this another demigod named Enkidu, who is very naturalistic, kind of very, of nature. And he doesn't even, kind of go into the city at first. They have to send out a temple prostitute who seduces him, and at first only gets him to wear clothes and eat cooked food. So he's kind of being reintegrated into society. And then he's living with these shepherds outside of town. And it's not until a visitor comes in who's going to a wedding in the city, and the visitor explains to Enkidu that Gilgamesh is going to have sex with the bride on the night of the wedding first. And Enkidu becomes so enraged by this that he immediately goes off to fight Gilgamesh. So I think what you see in the story is really just the angst that a previously equal, hunter-gatherer soul is dealing with the fact that they're now living in a sedentary society that has powerful men that just totally break down and ignore those rules of equality that made the earlier society work so well. And so, this polygamous, fact of life exists for a long time, pretty much up until Christianity, and that is the subject of chapter 3 in the book.
Yeah, I just really quickly, I've actually wondered about this. So monogamy. So Christianity has I want to say this very specifically. It has a Jewish root. Obviously, Judaism and Jews are still a thing, but Christianity is based on a Jewish foundation. But if you read the Hebrew Bible, especially Genesis, but even after Genesis, obviously Solomon, polygamy is a thing. It's mentioned not as an exceptional thing. It's mentioned as if you're a rich guy, you will have multiple wives.
No, it's a fact of life, right? So you have Moses coming down with the 10 commandments, right? And one of them is thou shalt not cover your neighbor's wife. Okay, that's great. But then, 2 chapters later, there's a law that is written right there in Deuteronomy that says not only can you covet your neighbor's daughter, you can buy her into slavery. And as long as you treat her well, you can keep her. But if you don't treat her as well as a wife, then you have to return her back to her father. So not only is it saying that, adultery or sleeping with women that aren't your wife is okay, but, you can buy your neighbor's daughter and have sex with her if you want, as long as you follow these rules.
Yeah. And, just really quickly, the Ashkenazi stopped doing polygamy until the Jews of Europe, but actually Jews in the Islamic world continued to do polygamy until, Yemeni Jews. Last I checked, there are no Yemeni. There's one Yemeni Jew left in the world, but they actually continued their marriages. Their polygamous marriages were actually recognized when they initially moved to Israel. So there was still some of that going on. Obviously, Israel doesn't allow it, so it's done, at least for Jews. It's a different history than the Christian West, which we're going to get to. But really quickly, so you pointed to Solon and his laws in Athens. So in Christianity, there's Athens and Jerusalem, that dichotomy. But in Christianity, it was obviously mostly by the end of the empire, most of the Christians, the vast majority are Gentiles. They're not Jewish. They don't come from a Jewish background, even if they worship the God of the Jews, the God of Abraham. And in the Roman world, it was notable that Roman and Greek men, in particular, elite men, they had a single wife. And talk about how that emerged.
Sure. So, if you, as I said, when you start reading the Iliad, when you start reading Homer, you start off with this huge war that's set off by a stealing of a woman, and so Greek society at the time was very warlike, just like the Babylonians were, etc. And Solon wanted to try to weaken the patriarchal clans that were trying to dominate and create all this war. So what he did is that he said the only way someone can be a citizen is if they come from the legal marriage between 2 other citizens. So what this means was powerful men still could, if they wanted, have a mistress, have a concubine, have sex with a slave, or unfortunately a young boy, whatever else, but only the offspring from his legal marriage would then have the rights of citizenship under the Greek city-state. And so this, as professors wiser than me have pointed out, this started creating a more civic identity that identified citizenry and Greekness over the previous identity of what patriarchal clan you belong to. And so even though this wasn't the bringing on of the more equal marriage we have today, at least it was kind of a unilateral marriage that ended up becoming what we practice in the United States or in the Western world today.
Yeah. It's that, what you're describing in the book is kind of like the stepwise progression to what we would recognize in the West, in the modern world. And it didn't occur it wasn't like Athena coming out of Zeus's head all formed. There was a series of steps. So you start out with the evolution, these are kind of like the furniture, the mental furniture that we have to manipulate, and you can toggle it in different ways. And then agriculture happens, and that reorders society, and there's all this inequality. Well, at some point, people start realizing this is just not sustainable. You can't have, like, God kings tend to die in violent ways and all these things. And then, this is Peter Turchin talks about, the evolutionary biologist in Connecticut, talks about how a lot of these axial age religions emerge, partly just as like cultural stabilizers, where they have much more egalitarian ethos, and it's much less unequal in theory, at least, than the Bronze Age, right? So you start to have these adapters, and you could argue monogamy, the way you're describing, is one of those adapters, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Jesus or Paul sat down and said, we're going to create a more efficient society by reinforcing monogamy. I think it came from a much more honest place, and a much more kind of different understanding of the equal dignity of all humans and all human life. But those ideas were circulating in the Greek kind of Jewish world, and I do think they end up having an expression in the form of Jesus, his teachings, and then not more importantly, but because it's the writings we have that kind of solidified it, the writings of Paul. And you do have this revolutionary change in marriage that does come from the New Testament, that does come from Christianity, that does come from these writings. So you have Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians saying, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, which is normal for the entire world. That's not in the Revolutionary Era. But the next clause is, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And it was that new co-equal monogamy. It was that new reciprocal monogamy that the man owed equal marital duties to the wife that the wife owed to the man. That was what was revolutionary, and that's what ended up changing the world.
Yeah, and so you refer to Kyle Harper's book, about like sex in the ancient world. I did read that. I really have to say, like, that's a difficult book to read for a modern person.
Loved it.
I mean, well, just like some of the descriptions, like child brothels and stuff like that.
You're saying, yeah, no, okay.
Yeah,
there's some gory.
I mean, basically, pre-modern people. It's like it's weird
is it Tom Holland who says the pre-modern people are really alien to us? I think
Holland. It's implied in Harper. It's pretty obvious, but I think Holland was very explicit about it. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, but they have our brains, they have our instincts. So it's like, I mean, if you lived then, I'm just saying, it's like most comes
normal. Yeah, you would think it was.
Yeah, so it's like in the book, and like I think this is like not a tension, but it's like a reality people have a hard time understanding. Is like, we have these like biological instincts that are real, but how they're expressed in culture varies. And so sometimes some things are cultural, and then some things are biological. So, for example, like just concretely for the listener, I think it's true that a small minority of males, for example, just have a strong homosexual preference, in terms of like sex, right? But then you read about the ancient Greeks, or frankly modern Arabs, and like a lot of men are engaging in homosexuality, right? So you're like, as an American, you're like, are they gay? No, they're not gay. They think that they think all they're doing is just. So you described it in the book, which I was like, okay, like that makes sense. For the pre-Christian Romans, the Greeks, or just for a lot of peoples, but definitely in those, because the slaves and everything like that, their inequality, sex is like to a great extent like masturbation, right?
Yes.
And so with slaves, it's like whatever, as long as you're penetrative, like you're not gay. It's not gay if you're the penetrator, right? That's their attitude.
That's the Roman understanding.
Yeah, it's actually like pretty common understanding across a lot of societies. We don't have that understanding, and it's just, I think partly it goes back to the Christian teachings that you're talking about reciprocity, right? Where, so you mentioned how feminists think that Christianity, some feminists, probably most, frankly, is oppressive and all that stuff. Talk about like, how monogamy and this idea of like marriage through consent and love and free choice, like how all of that, helped women.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to kind of I guess take a step back forward. I just want to give a shout out to Joseph Heinrich here and his marriage family program, because I feel at this point we have to say that of course Jesus doesn't come come down from the cross, be resurrected, and then all of a sudden a flip is switched, and Europe is monogamous, because that's not how things work. Instead, you have Christianity spreading, and one of the ways that it is spreading is through monogamous marriage, and they end up having what Joseph Heinrich identifies as kind of like a marriage family program. Number one is a ban on polygamy outright. Number two is a ban on inheritance to illegitimate offspring. Three is a ban on arranged marriages, which for Christians, the thinking there is that arranged marriages are not consensual, and that the fundamental aspect of an equal Christian union had to be the consent of the parties. And you can see this in Christian teachings up to today. And then fourth is a ban on cousin marriages, because cousin marriages often were just arranged marriages. So as this is spreading, this becomes advantageous for women in a number of ways. That is that especially the early church had options for women to participate in life that weren't, in the role of a subservient wife to a patriarchal clan. You could serve as and many of them did, as a deacon, whether you were married or not. Now, it's not like today where a single woman could be involved in the church and have sex with whoever you want. If you were a single woman within the church, within the first, second century, you were being celibate at the time, which was Apostle Paul was as well, and he encouraged other people to do so. But he also said, look, if and he acknowledges this, and this is a big kind of concession to why Christianity is able to spread. If you feel like you have to have sex, you can have sex, but it must be with a married partner, and that is how the norm of marriage that we understand today spread through Europe and then the rest of the world.
Yeah, just to be clear, for high status women, premarital sex was in quote traditional societies, before, and non-Christian societies, was banned. But for men, whatever.
Well, like we covered before, for men, not only was premarital sex fine, postmarital sex, as long as it wasn't with the wife of another citizen, was also fine. Yeah. Even encouraged, and frankly, if you weren't having it, you were considered weird.
Yes, and like as you acknowledge in the book, for like high status men, even in Christian Europe, this has always been kind of like a battle between the church and the high nobility and the king, because they want it all,
Right. But, you have this weird alliance where you have, a lot of the kings kind of recognize that adopting this marriage family program weakens their rival clans, so that as long as they can be the ones partnering with the church to be the number one ruler, that the marriage family program actually weakens their allies' ability to challenge them. But then the church itself then becomes a check on power, as I point out in the book. You have the Magna Carta, which many people think of as a contract between the king and the nobility, but it's actually a three-party contract written by the church in order to protect the church's rights to be independent from the state. And the only reason we know the Magna Carta, because there are actually a lot of different pacts and treaties signed between not just King John, other kings and the nobility, that we have been forgotten in history. The only reason you know the Magna Carta is because the church was brought in with it, and the church was given specific rights and privileges within the English state that the church then promoted it, copied it, distributed it, and made it the law that we know of today. And so in that way, the church also then became a check on the state's power, on the power of powerful clans.
Yeah, I think in modern language we would say the church was a stakeholder in the Magna Carta.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they were incentivized for it. The marriage family program, Joe Henrich's idea is weird. The Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed. This is like not like necessarily like the focus of your book, which is like specifically the monogamous marriage. But this is all part of like a package that kind of created Western civilization, and ultimately led to modernity. And like you in this book actually trace. I mean, you have a different emphasis because it's emphasized marriage and and we're going to talk about the second half of the book now, in terms of the policies in America. But you're tracing many of the same paths as these cultural evolutionists and anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, and I think it's great. I think people need to just, again, I think it's important to know that yes, we have these instincts. So, for example, if you're a high status male, the mammalian instinct is still there to just like spread your seed. Yeah, which I'd actually like. Look, you talked about this is like my, bailiwick, but like, the Y chromosomal evidence is pretty clear that around like 4,000 years ago, a bunch of like hyper males, just like replaced like all the other lineages. I'm descended from one. You're probably descended from one. Yeah. And it's like, but like at some point people realize, wait a second, like this is not a sustainable project for a civilization. So, let's talk about so we talked about like Christianity and obviously the marriage family program. That's a big deal. Okay, so we get to the United States. Let's talk about United States, de Tocqueville.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
So as much as the Western world kind of separated itself from the rest of the world in the sense that they moved away from patriarchal clan structures, America even did that to an nth degree, and it was noticeable. So noticeable, in fact, that when Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, he wrote, in America, the family taking this word in its Roman aristocratic sense does not exist. And he's exactly right. The sense of the patriarchal Roman family was just antithetical to the American spirit, in that from the beginning, America was about sons and daughters going off, forming their own nuclear families, forming their own lives, and really being free to make their own futures. So then you have John Adams, one of the founders, saying that the foundations of national morality must be laid in private families. In vain are schools, academies, and universities instituted if they lose principles and licentious habits are imposed upon their children in the earliest years. So this was supported by law from the very beginning, and then in the mid to late 1800s, you start having some kind of often experimentations. I go into the Oneida community of upstate New York that did try to live in a promiscuous horde. That doesn't end well. You can read about the details there. Kind of more important to at least the legal history of the book is the Mormons. So I think if you go to law school, you're familiar with one case, Reynolds versus United States, where Congress passes a law, basically kind of banning polygamy, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with the United States government, with Congress, saying that this is a Christian nation, we're monogamous, we can, force Mormons to stop being polygamous, even though it's part of their religion. What I didn't know until I started reading this book is that's just one case. There's then two other cases as the Mormons keep practicing polygamy, and Congress keeps upping the ante as far as like punishments and everything else to get the Mormons to stop, and they don't up until like the third and final case, which is like the United States versus the Church of Latter-day Saints, where Congress basically wrote a law saying your church no longer exists, and we're taking all your land. So that case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And I really challenge anyone to go back, and all the case names are in the book, read these cases. The language of these cases is like from another universe today. Like the way they describe the nation as a Christian nation, and that Congress has the power and the authority to promote monogamous unions throughout the country. You're just like, whoa, when was this, the consensus? And it was at the time. So shortly after the Mormons lose their case, there's a new revelation. Polygamy is now banned within Mormons. And then as I mentioned in the book, Mormons today are one of the most practiced, prolific practicers of monogamy and nuclear family. And then from there, you can go in and look at Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. A lot of people don't realize what a believer in women's rights and equal marriage Teddy Roosevelt was. He actually wrote his undergraduate thesis at Harvard on why women should have the right to vote. As a legislator in New York City, not only did he write a law that criminalized spousal abuse, but the mandated punishment was public flogging. And so he was, he very much was trying to promote the nuclear family as the foundation of the United States. And then when you go up to the Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, as I go through the book, everything you go through there, the Social Security Act, all the labor stuff, everything is built around getting a man a job so a man can support a wife and build a family. And that was, as I say in the book, that was the American family consensus up through until the late 1960s, early 70s.
Well, so I think you're explicit in the book. Part of the reason that you go through all of this is, with the American part in particular, is there is, I think Stephanie Kuntz, I read her book, was it 2006? It was a long time ago. But she's one of the big marriage scholars, and I think, as you mentioned, I didn't watch it. There's a Netflix thing on monogamy. I think she was in it, and so she's like a monogasplainer, a marriage splainer. And so the idea is the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, which I think people of our generation, we watched the sitcoms in rerun. I think maybe if I have a 20-year-old listener, they're like, what are you talking about? But, it was like, that was like the family. That was the ideal. A mom stays at home, a dad goes out to work. And you talk about how it was a little different in some ways than the 19th century model, but it also is a natural outcome or an evolution of, I think, American marriage. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it was kind of a blip, but it was still the norm. The nuclear family was still the norm, right? So you have, for most of the United States history, what is called the corporate family, okay? And all that means is that up until industrialization, most families were their own economic unit. Okay, so you had mom and dad, either as a farm or as a butcher shop or as, whatever the family business was. Mom, dad, and the kids were all working together as an economic unit to do that. And no one was really, kind of working outside the home. If anything, women worked outside the home the most, in the sense that they would, sell things, baked goods or clothing or whatever else. But most of the economic activity was within families. It wasn't until industrialization that you have men going off into factories, getting paid by a third party, that at first was a boon to the family, because men were able to go earn a family supporting wage so early into their life. At the beginning of industrialization, the average age of first marriage actually falls substantially, as does the average age of that women get married and start having children, as men are able to, start out on their own earlier in life. And then, of course, you have the Depression is just a blip. It goes up a little bit, but then after the war, everything in the United States economically is going great. It falls even further, and then it's not until you have the 1960s, 1970s that this very strong model of the family kind of falls apart. But you do have in the 40s and 50s, because some of the laws that FDR passed, you do have women that because of appliances, because of all these labor saving things in the home, you do have women that are spending a lot less time, producing in the home as an economic unit than you did before. And so that's when you do kind of have that 50s housewife thing that is kind of culturally a blip. But that doesn't change the fact that before that, the foundation was a corporate nuclear family where a husband and wife were, producing together economically.
Yeah, and even in that, I know, the 50s family does not exist today, but, it's not normative, shall we say, but there are a lot of high-powered people, let's say they work in finance or maybe in tech as a VP or whatever, where mostly it's men that are doing these roles, but I do know a small minority of cases where it's women, and then the other partner is a stay-at-home, and they just take care of everything else. Because you see it in a curve on graphs as far as stay at home. When it comes to kind of people on the lower economic end, it is very often still the man who goes out and earns a paycheck, and the mom stays home, takes care of the kids. And then there's a middle where both partners are working. But then when you get back up there, and this is very highly educated women who probably could earn a lot more, but because they have equally successful partners, are able to choose to stay at home, and many of them do. Yep. Yeah. I was thinking about when I was reading that section. I have a friend She's 20, almost 27. Well, no, she's 27, almost 27, and she graduated. I will just say like top 12, whatever, like top tier law school. She's a clerk, and so I didn't like explore what she wanted to do in the future. Young woman, whatever. She's like dating a friend of mine. They're pretty serious, and the other day she just mentioned, because we were talking about kids and stuff like that. Like, I'm always interested when people want to have kids and how they're going to figure it out with their career. And she was just like, well, if I'm going to give a fake name. If Kevin, if the business is successful, I'm hoping that I'll be pregnant and at home in my late 20s. And I was just like, oh, okay, But I've heard this sort of thing from like very educated women that can have careers, but the dream is their husband makes enough money so that they can just focus on the children, focus on the family. That's what they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's crazy. Right. And for up until, the 1970s and Betty Friedan and everything else, most women thought the same. I mean, most still do. But, you didn't have the Disney Corporation shoving, women must be independent down your throat all the time.
Sure. And I think like probably the peak of this for the professional class was the lean in girl boss phase that of the last decade. Pushed by Sheryl Sandberg, former Facebook COO, and there are people, there are women and men who can have it all, but I think the fundamental problem is all attainable on the societal level. It doesn't seem like it from what we can tell.
No, and then we were all going to start getting political here because this is the Democratic boogeyman of family policy, which is the overarching goal is always female work participation. Okay. So you have this paper written by the Biden White House. I have a lot of friends that are I call them for, pronatal people. There's a whole movement. So the Biden White House actually writes a paper about declining fertility rates. And, they acknowledge all the negatives of declining fertility, but then their solution, I swear to God, is to get mothers back into the workforce faster, is to make sure we have as many mothers working as possible. And of course, the entire Democratic agenda is all bent on pushing moms out of the home and into the workforce as quickly as possible for as long as possible. And I was kind of amazed they admitted it and put it down on paper, but they did. And so that really is kind of the different visions of the parties. You have, Vance saying, look, if you want to work, great, but a lot of women want to be able to be at home with their kids, with their children. Actually, most of it want to work part-time. There's very a minority that only doesn't want to work at all. Most of them want to have some type of part-time job, but that they can focus on the family, everything else. And the Republican Party is like, we support that. And the Democrats are like, no, we want every mom working all the time.
Yeah, actually, isn't in Northern Europe, like in places like the Netherlands, Netherlands and Sweden, it ends up happening that there's a huge number of women who work part time, do not work full time, and it's the U.S. in particular has an emphasis on women as full time. And then
you see this in the CEOs, and that women, or the United States actually has a higher percentage of women in high CEO positions, and it's because we do push them back into work. Whereas in a lot of European countries, the boardrooms are still a lot more male focused, and it's because women choose to, go to work part time, still have a career, but not have the career be the end all and be all of their identity.
Yes, I want to jump back to the 60s when it all changed, because that's a big part of the book. Before we talk about the policies and the present, but I do have to say, I think one of the issues that I feel about feminism as it's worked out in the United States since after World War II. Let's ignore the suffragettes in the first wave, which is a different thing.
The book doesn't. I cover Elizabeth Cady Stanton positively.
Yeah. It does. She was I actually have a biography of her that I read. Very admirable woman. That's what I'm gonna say. Admirable person. I don't really care about the gender, right? But aside from that, I do have to say it seems like Betty Friedan, who wrote she wrote The Feminine Mystique, or which one did she write? She wrote. The thing with Betty Friedan and some of these second wave feminists that are high powered professional women intellectuals. The problem that I have retrospectively that I realize about feminism now is it was good for them. but most women are not going to be professional intellectuals, right? They don't want to be in the pantsuits all the time. And so I think, and it started in the 60s. Well, I mean, it was a little earlier than that with the 50s, but still, a lot of things started changing in the 50s with women's lib and whatnot. Can you talk about the changes in the 60s with monogamy and go back to the marriage and welfare? Like you could talk about it all. Like there's a lot of stuff. I mean, people of our age, I don't think we understand. No, we can't intuitively understand how much the world changed between, say, 1960 and 1968 in those 6 years.
Sure. So I probably have it more between 68 and 73.
Okay.
But the beginning is kind of a intellectual foundations of kind of not just feminism, but really more cultural relativism, right? That kind of all cultures are equal. Polygamy is just as good as monogamy. And so, get a lot of different starts there, but I focus on Margaret Mead, who, was an anthropologist. She was big on, I think her book was Life of a Young Girl in Samoa, but basically she portrayed this kind of native culture as being very promiscuous and free, and and that it was great for young women, and that the United States should allow their young women to be just as equally promiscuous. Of course, you go back, and pretty much everything Margaret Mead wrote in this book was wrong. The girls of Samoa were not promiscuous at all. They were just they had, as I noted in the book, they were part of the polygamous world order. Then you had Christian missionaries arrive. They were, a Christian society, and the girls were maybe slightly a little bit more promiscuous on average than American girls, but nowhere near the extent to which she made it seem like a completely different culture. But you had this idea of cultural relativism spreading, and then you have Alfred Kinsey comes along. He was actually a biologist studying wasps when the Ford Foundation gave him a bunch of money to study sex. His reports were in popular culture. They're cited in model legal penal codes. You start seeing them in judicial opinions. But it's all bullshit. He was not a scientist. He was an activist. The Kinsey Institute admits this on their website. They say pretty much none of his findings stand today. He was not using anything close to a scientific method. His biographers point out that he encouraged his staff to have sleep with each other. He found pornographic movies of him having sex with other people in his house. This was not an objective scientist. This was a man with an agenda to push sexual.
If people knew what Kinsey was like, they would call it, in that era, they'd say, you're a pervert.
Yeah,
he was a pervert.
And he was. But he was highly influential. Like his study comes up in model penal codes and judicial decisions. So you have this elite consensus forming basically against marriage, basically against the American family consensus. And so I narrow it down to three Supreme Court cases between 1968 and 1973 that basically rewrite the entirety of American family law. So the big one for me is Eisenstadt v. Baird. So for a lot of conservatives, the boogeyman of the legal left is Griswold versus Connecticut, which they see as the predecessor to, of course, Roe v. Wade, which is since been overturned. Griswold is a 1965 case, and it found this is important, a Fourth and Fifth Amendment right in a marital couple to birth control. Okay. This is important because this was in line with a long string of cases, Meyer versus Nebraska, other cases where the court said, look, the nuclear family is the foundation of civil society. The state can't go in and penetrate that and tell the nuclear family how to run their life. They can't tell them how to educate their children. They can't tell them which languages to teach, and they can't tell them to use or not to use birth control. That's 1965. The language in Griswold is very in line with that American family consensus case that the monogamous family is the foundation of society. So 65. So then by 73, you have Eisenstadt v. Baird. Now, in this case, the court just gets rid of all that language about monogamy, family, everything else. They say, no, none of that's important. What's important is the individual. There's a 14th Amendment right to contraception. And that's where you have the basically legal framework today. And marriage just falls apart after that. I also talk about King v. Smith, which is about marriage penalties, and Miller versus California, which significantly liberated the previous test for prosecuting pornography. Basically, after Miller versus California, that's when you get Deep Throat and all that 70s porn boom takes off. And it's all because of the changing of the standard for prosecuting pornography in that Miller versus California case. And then with those three cases, that just completely opens up the sexual floodgates. And you can see it in the data. It happens first with the African-American family because of the welfare penalties. But, up until the 1960s, young African-American men and women were actually more likely to be married than their white counterparts. That ticks down a little bit by 1970. By 1980, it's like in the 20s, like 20%, and it just has never recovered. And then, of course, since the 1980s, that has been spread to Hispanic and white households as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's a Moynihan report. I mean, basically, it was prophetic, right?
Yes, except for the fact that it did not predict that what happened to the Black family would happen to other families. So
I got it.
Moynihan actually goes into this long, I would say ungrounded, case about what happened to the African-American family. My case is much more about economics in the sense that the welfare state really forced young African-American women to choose between either the welfare state or a husband, and they didn't allow them to have both.
Well, I mean, so, the way you're describing it is after World War II, like in the 60s and 70s. So you had kind of like a legal assault on the centrality of the nuclear family. You had an economic assault in terms of the way the mean-tested welfare programs, especially in the lower class, incentivize singlehood as opposed to like a legal marriage. Mm-hmm. And then you had like a cultural transformation where movies like Carnal Knowledge basically promote polyamory and swinging and all these other things. There was even one thing that I have to say is like it's not all one direction. I think like in the 80s there was like when we were growing up, in the 80s and 90s, I think there was a little bit of a shift back. So there's some baseball players that did a wife swap in the 1970s. I don't think that would have happened in the 80s or 90s. You know what I'm saying?
Fair. That's fair.
So there was like a little bit of like a blip, and then but all of this has happened, and that's resulted in the transformation of society. And so then you have going back to like current policy, you have someone like J.D. Vance who's talking about cat ladies and all these. Maybe he could have said it a little bit differently, but obviously he has a particular view of what the Republican Party should be, what we should promote as policy, which is a little bit different than I think than AEI, economic libertarianism of the 1980s, 90s. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think, where to begin? So I guess, would say the only part I think you left out is the decline in wages for low-scale male workers in the past since the 70s, right? So when you look at wages overall, they're up. When you look at women's wages for all categories, low skill, medium, high school, they're up. When you look at wages for men with college education, they're way up. But wages have actually fallen for low skill men. And guess where marriage has fallen the most? Exactly in that population, right? So there's just a number of things, a number of policies that particularly harm low skill men that we could change, that we could address to raise marriage rates. I mentioned, illegal immigration, low skill immigration. I mentioned tightening trade with China, maybe not, trading China with all, maybe go with countries that, kind of have labor standards more closely to our own. But there are other kind of less partisan ones as well. I mentioned pornography, right? I mean, here you have men getting addicted to it, men using it as a substitute for actual human contact. And it's a poor substitute, but a lot of them, if they can't get it, if instead of making the effort to better themselves, to get some type of physical intimacy, they can get fake physical intimacy from porn. And you just see in the statistics, there are studies, the more men watch porn, the less they likely are to try out and get women. But then there's also new ones like, sports gambling made it into the book, right? So here you have online sports gambling apps. Anyone who's a football fan or a sports fan in general knows that watching a game today is light years different than watching a game 5-10 years ago, because we're constantly having sports betting shoved down our throats. Well, because of the way this was legalized state by state, we now have tons of studies about what this does, and it's terrible. Bankruptcies go up, credit card debt goes up, suicides, depression. And again, guess who is suffering the most? Young, low-skilled men, the exact men we need to be bettering themselves, picking themselves up, going to school, becoming financially stable. They are being hit the hardest. And so we don't need some libertarian Cato philosophy where it's just like, oh, we'll let the market sort it out. Let the porn and the gambling and the free trade and the illegal immigrants all come in. And if the men in this country don't make it, too effing bad is the libertarian message. And that's just not going to cut it. That's not going to cut it in the Trump administration. That's not going to cut with JD Vance. The realization is that we need government to come in, reset some of these boundaries so that we can create an environment where young men can succeed and become partners for women who want partners. Because that's what most women want.
Yeah, and let's talk about, I'll bring something up, like, because we've alluded here, there's human nature, like there's multiple aspects of human nature. So obviously the monogamous pair bond, I mean, there are just like psychological predispositions we have that make it work for us. On the other hand, people are greedy. Some people are really greedy, and if you have the money, so I was so I go to Silicon Valley a lot just for work, work in tech, whatever. And Sergey Brin was doing this for a long time. Okay, like I'm just gonna name check. I guess I'm never gonna get money from him, but like I'm just gonna say it. There are certain like men in Silicon Valley that make a lot of money. That they have hundreds of millions of dollars. Like they don't, not even billions like Brin, and they just have like a lifestyle where everyone understands. They're gonna have girlfriends for about, like, they might even be monogamous, but like you got 6 months. They're gonna get bored with you. They're gonna move on. And they do this like throughout their life. Usually like, when they're young, they get married, whatever, they do the middle class thing, they exit, divorce, and then they just live the serial monogamous life. Not always, frankly, monogamous. But this is actually, in my opinion, and I don't know if anyone's written about this, I think this has actually caused a problem in the dating market in the Bay Area. There aren't that many guys like this, but they distort the expectations of everybody in terms of like how, everyone thinks that they're going to be, Shanahan, the one who was married to Sergey and had a kid and got $1 billion. Okay. So a lot of women think like they're not going to be the 6-month girl. They're going to be the one he marries. Right. And so obviously they're not going to date some like L5 engineer at Google because like they could be with an exited like 100 millionaire. And, these guys are just like enjoying themselves. So the whole system of the whole system is just like whack because of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I actually grew up in Oakland, but I'm not in Silicon Valley now. But I mean, you can see some of this data in any of the data apps. Any of the data apps that share their data show that the responses that men they get are highly undistributed. That you have the 9s and 10s, the 5s out of the that get.
It's a Pareto principle for men,
right? 80-90% of the responses from women, whereas with women it's the opposite. If you're average looking, you'll have average looking men trying to go after you. So yeah, there's absolutely a problem there. It's kind of like a re-polygamization of society in that sense. And it does have downriver consequences. But yeah, I mean, I think it is something culturally that needs to change. But there are, like I mentioned before, a lot of public policy fixes we can make to at least make it a lot less worse on a number of fronts.
Well, as we're closing out this conversation, so we are recording in January. This will be posted in January, so relevant. But we're at the beginning, where the Trump administration has not begun yet. JD Vance is the vice president elect. Are you optimistic about the American family? I mean, how are you feeling about the American family in 2025? Because you've like gone from like 50,000 BC to 2025. You've covered like, the whole collapse since the 60s. You have diagnosed the problem. Now, are there fixes on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I've already outlined a number here, and I do think that that Vance and Trump are less so Trump kind of ideologizing everything else, but I mean, Vance I think definitely has said many similar things to what I've just been saying today. Like Vance gets it, and I do think he is the future of the party, kind of policy wise. And, I think anytime you're looking at politics, stuff can go wrong. Stuff always does go wrong. But I think also with, kind of the overreach of the trans movement, overreach of Black Lives Matter movement, I do think there's going to be a little bit of a cultural retrenchment, which kind of turns back to more traditional values. And I hope monogamous marriage is one of them.
Well, I mean, if JD Vance becomes president or whatever, I will say he would be the Zoomers would say he's president wife guy. He's definitely a wife guy.
He's
right?
definitely a wife guy. Absolutely.
I don't know about Donald Trump. You know what I'm saying? There's different.
I people bring this up all the time, and my response is, Donald Trump is bad, but imagine Donald Trump without the cultural restrictions of monogamous marriage, right? Imagine how much worse he would be.
So Donald Trump is he's like, we're gonna get the best concubines for the harem.
Exactly. Just imagine Trump
biggest
without the cultural expectation of monogamous marriage.
That is great. Yeah, that is a great point. That's exactly what would have happened. Like every floor of Trump Tower would have. Oh my God, that's totally true. I think that's can totally bring it home, because I think that's a hook where it's oh, of course. He would in a polygamous society. I mean, if Donald, honestly, he loves rich Gulf Arabs.
Yeah.
I'm
sure he's a little jealous.
Yeah, I think on some level he's just this is pretty, I don't see the problem with it, because they like bling, they like gold, and they have huge harems. You know what I'm saying? Yep. They live big, they live blingy.
It would be an easy transition for Trump, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I was just he's already very, very keyed into that, and that's how a lot of guys you think that they're these. They're civilized by their wives. They're in this monogamous marriage, and then they for example, Sergey Brin kind of went wild after he split. These high status guys, right? And you see this other side to them. And I think what we got in this conversation is people are oh well, nuclear family, this is the family from the beginning and all this stuff, and other people are well, actually we're this promiscuous horde. But the reality is there's multiple configurations that humans can settle in on and have settled in on, even if we have kind of a shared human nature, right? We're a flexible species, and there's cultural variation, and the choice is on us, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, the only point I would make there is that I do, and I make this argument in the book, I do think the reason why monogamy, once it took hold in Europe and then spread to the world, was because it is a better model, is a better fit for human nature, is a better fit for human cooperation. Yeah. The data is all there. In polygamous societies, there's crime. There's less cooperation, there's less trust. So I do think monogamy makes us a better cooperative unit that then makes us all flourish better.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that would be my only response.
Yeah, I actually want to mention this fact in the podcast. I'll just add it on at the end. The highest recorded fertility for women that we've ever had in recorded history, from what I know, is from New England in the late 17th century, and these were monogamous societies, right? Women were having in the low the median woman was having in the low teens number of births. So monogamous societies, they compete better. I mean, that's fundamentally the truth. Individually, men might want to be polygamous because every man thinks that they're going to be Donald Trump or Genghis Khan. Right. So this is again every man thinks that they're going to win on the sports bet, right? It's that doesn't, just because that's your instinct doesn't mean that's how it's going to work out, and we got to be careful. So it was great talking to you. I think people will enjoy the book. I obviously recommend everyone buy it, check it out. Just the references are great. There's a lot of little rabbit holes. I was I knew some of this stuff actually about the policy stuff, but you hit everything. I didn't know much of the legal stuff actually. So there's something in the book for everybody. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed this conversation, Conn.
I did too, Conn.
Oh wait, did I say? Oh yeah. Okay, that's funny. Okay, we got a comedian in the house. All right, I'll talk to you later, bro.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Bye.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite